Avot. Pirkei Avot means chapters of the fathers. So this section of the Mishnah is a collection of wisdom sayings and teachings by the sages of our tradition. And there are a lot of greatest hits because, I mean, it's a really, really excellent book. So it's a little bit hard.
All greatest hits, right?
Well, they're all greatest
hits. Compilation of the greatest.
That's right.
So we can start from the beginning, and we'll be back at the end of the week.
Yeah. But there are. I think there are definitely greatest hits that probably some of you know off the top of your head. And we're going to. I think we want to kind of start there when we get to text. But first, I think it might be good, since this is really kind of the first section or the first session on this particular topic, to go in depth. Might be good for us to give an overview of what Pirkei Avot is, its history, etc. Rabbi, would you like to do that? Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, well, we can go through a few points. I'll do some, and then, as I'm sure there's information that I'll give that, each one of us will be able to build on each other. The first thing to note about Pirkei Avot is that, unlike the rest of the tractates of the Mishnah, there's nothing halachic here. None of it is binding. When it goes through other tractates of the Mishnah, if you look through it, it starts off with the column, or the order of things that are grown. So it goes through all the laws about a farmer, especially in those days. That was what the common occupation was, farming. So it goes through the laws of farming, what are the laws of tithing your grain and bringing the truma, and all the different laws that would be applied. For example, this year in Israel, we have a Shemitah year. It's a year of resting, that we're not meant to work the ground. So it goes through those laws, etc. It goes through what are the laws? How does the law apply to me? Pirkei Avot is actually no law. It's all traditional things. It's all advice, so to speak, or what you'd call in Hebrew, in the term in the Talmud, is lifnim mishur tzaddik. It's something that you want to live above the letter of the law. You want to live a better life than just the base, right? You could be just a good person, or you could be doing something more. And that's really what Pirkei Avot is focusing on. What would be called in Talmudic times midat chassidut, the attributes of kindness, being an extra kind person. That's really what the law. So nothing here should be binding by Torah law. None of this is binding by Torah law. It's advice. It's the way to live your life. And what you'll find actually is, if you look at the quote, the author of any quote, there's actually a reason why that is the author. That's the quote of that author the author of that quote, which is something that's very fascinating. That we find some of the backstory of some of these rabbis tells us why the quote that they're making is made. Just one interesting trivia note on the Pirkei Avot is that actually Rabbi Stoller said that it's 6 chapters. Not to correct him, it's actually only 5 chapters. In the original text of the Pirkei Avot, it's 5 chapters. And if you look in the original text, it's 5 chapters. The 6 chapters added on from what's known as the Brisa. And the reason why it's added on is because the tradition that began, the rabbis started a tradition that between the holiday of Pesach, which is coming up now, and the holiday of Shavuot, which is really the longest Shabbos days of the year, right? It's when the longest daytime that we have. So they didn't want people just sitting around doing nothing on Shabbat afternoon, right? They finished their cholent, their hot cholent. Now they're going to just take a nap and nap for 6 or 7 hours because it's a really long afternoon. So they instituted studying a chapter of the Pirkei Avot. Now, we know that between Pesach and Shavuos, there's 7 weeks, but you have to keep in mind that some of it is holiday. So there's actually 6 Shabboses between Pesach and Shavuot. So they wanted there to be 6. They instituted studying a chapter of Pirkei Avot, but there was one missing. So they incorporated a chapter from another source, which is the Brisa, discussing similar topics, similar ideas of things which you can do to make your life a better life, to be a better person. Just a little bit of trivia to add on to that. And there really there's a ton to learn. And when you study the Pirkei Avot, you can read it, and the text on the surface is quite fascinating. But when you dig a little deeper, it's actually even more fascinating. There's so much underneath. There's so much on the layer under, and then even the layer under, etc. So every time you study it, really, you can get it on another depth, on another level, and really incorporate those teachings into your life in a very positive way.
Nice. So I want to add a couple of things, and then I'll pose the question of what we kind of know about Pirkei Avot and start getting into some of the sections. What I'd like to add is I think of Pirkei Avot, in addition to being the advice and the wisdom teachings of the sages. Pirkei Avot also gives us, in miniature, a history of the chain of tradition. And it serves in some ways as kind of the constitution of the rabbinic movement. So at the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, I want to ask Karen, could you share the screen? Just go to chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot, the very beginning of Pirkei Avot. We can look at it on the screen. Okay, so here it is. The very beginning says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. The men of the great assembly are the initial sages. These are the kind of the founders of the rabbis. They said 3 things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence round the Torah. Okay, so that first sentence there is a history. It's a list of kind of generations. Moses got the Torah at Mount Sinai. He's the leader of the community, responsible for teaching Torah to the community. When Moses passes from the scene, the leadership goes on to Joshua. He's next. When he passes from the scene, it goes to the elders, and then to the prophets, and then to the men of the great assembly, the sages. So what does this tell us about the rabbis, the sages? Any thoughts? Why is this statement so important?
Isn't it like the old song?
What do you mean?
Tradition.
Tradition, yeah, it's like tradition. But this statement it's super important. Without this one sentence, I don't know, Judaism might be different. What's so important about this sentence about the rabbis? Looks like Steve might be making a move to unmute. Steve, are you unmuting? Yeah, go ahead.
The important is who has authority.
That's right. Yeah, that's it, right? So the first sentence of Pirkei Avot tells us that the rabbis, the men of the great assembly, and their descendants and intellectual, spiritual descendants, the sages, are in the direct line of the transmission of Torah from Sinai itself, from Moses. It is the sages who possess the Torah, right? And it's they get to make the decisions. They get to interpret it. They get to teach it to us. This is a statement of authority by this. It's the rabbis who wrote this text. And they're telling us in the introduction to Pirkei Avot, here's why we get to write this text, and why we get to write the Talmud, and why we're the ones who get to interpret the Torah, because we are the rightful intellectual, spiritual descendants of Moses, right? The Torah is handed to us. That's why I say this is the charter. This is the constitution of the rabbinic movement. So without it, the rest of the body of rabbinic literature, its place and its meaning and so forth would be different. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of that statement. Okay. So now, having given that introduction to Pirkei Avot, let's put it out to you guys. What do you know about Pirkei Avot? Do you know any teachings or sayings or anything about it? Let's start there.
There's a lot of emphasis on loving kindness. I know that.
Okay, Mike said there's a lot of emphasis on loving kindness. Yeah, and I think that goes to what Rabbi Eli was saying a minute ago, that Pirkei Avot is about going beyond the letter of the law and living by midat hasidut, the attributes of piety, and being better than just what's required, the minimum.
And really, if you think about midat hasidut, if you take that core word, it comes from the word chesed, which is literally kindness.
Mm-hmm.
So piety really is synonymous with kindness, which is interesting, but it's the way it should be.
Yeah.
A pious person can't be pious if he's not truly kind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just something to think about.
Yeah, and it's kind of, you might ask the question, like Rabbi Eli was saying at the beginning, the rest of the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot is part of the Mishnah, the rest of the Mishnah is halacha, law. this is a different kind of book. Why is it in the Mishnah? You know? And I think it goes to what Rabbi Eli was saying, which is that the Mishnah teaches the law, the basic requirements that you have to follow. Pirkei Avot comes to say, okay, but it's not enough just to follow the basic requirements. You really need to go beyond the letter of the law. You can't mandate that. It's hard to we say in American life, like, you can't legislate morality. You can't legislate kindness. You can't make it a law that you have to be kind. How would you measure that, right? So Pirkei Avot comes as a qualifier to the rest of the legal material in the Mishnah and says, like, okay, you have to do the baseline thing, but we want you to be better than just the baseline.
I see there are some comments in the chat. I wonder if anybody.
Let's see if there's a new one. I just looked at it a second ago. Karen is encouraging people to unmute yourselves and speak.
Yeah. And Karen, I think you could take the screen share down for the moment. Thank you.
I'm just going to add something interesting, a little bit more history onto what Rabbi Stoller was saying, is that line that we have, that tradition that goes from Moses on Sinai all the way down through, and it continues because the ensuing chapters and the ensuing Mishnahs, as they're called, the laws, or they're not really laws here, as we mentioned, are quotes from individuals. And it actually follows the line of that tradition. It goes on to the men of the Great Assembly, and then it goes on to some of the men of the Great Assembly, Shemaiah, Baftalion, some of the great sages, Hillel and Shammai are then on the list. So it goes through the tradition of the what's known as the Zugos, the peers that were the ones who continued the tradition after the Great Assembly. And there was actually a direct line until the end of the Second Temple. There was something called smicha. Smicha, literally, what you may have heard the term before, smicha means that someone becomes a rabbi, they get smicha. In those times, literal smicha was that the rabbi who was giving you smicha actually rested his hands. Smicha means to rest your hands, or to rest, or to lean. And the rabbi would lean his hands onto the student, and with that make him a rabbi. In other words, passing along the tradition that stemmed all the way back from Moses on Sinai. During the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, that was broken. That line was broken, and true smicha does not exist anymore. What Rabbi Stoller would have, and what I have, are quasi smichas. They're smicha in name only, and they're adopted from that original smicha. Just because we don't have that tradition anymore. We have these books, we can study from the books, and that's what we kind of do. But the true smicha follows this tradition that we have. Again, following that line that continues through the books, all the way through the first those first few chapters. It goes through the lineage, the time, and you'll find some of the highlighted rabbis. Rabbi Akiva makes an appearance because he's again part of that tradition. That you'll find you'll find that term kibel mehem. They accepted from the ones before, and then they are the ones that are the teachers of the next generation. That's the line that goes through for most of the Pirkei Avot, giving you again that tradition and that line that again was unbroken all the way until the end of the Second Temple's time.
Were there comments or questions or responses to my question? What do you know about Pirkei Avot? Do you know any
Anything in the chat?
sayings? Because we can start there, and if you know one or you have a question, maybe I think I might have heard that such and such, is in there. We could go to it and take a deeper look.
It's been alleged.
It's been alleged, yeah.
Was there, just to be more question, but was there at least part of the intent to, I don't quite want to say popularize, but to make wisdom more effectively communicable to the mainstream of people, that it was putting things in more kind of general, humble terms about what should be done.
Interesting. There's definitely that theme in certain cases. Certain of the passages discuss the idea of being kind to your students and not being mean to them, etc., and therefore making it more, as you're saying, communicable. But is it an exact theme? Is that the reason why it was written? I've never heard that.
Okay. So what I would say to that, Mike, is so Mike's question, if you couldn't hear, was is Pirkei Avot, or is there some kind of effort around Pirkei Avot to make the wisdom of the sages communicable and accessible, I think, to the broader community. I don't know about the audience, the intended audience, but what I do know is that within Pirkei Avot, the teachings of the sages are formulated in a variety of different ways. Some of them, anyway, are kind of clearly, I think, rhetorically formulated so as to be easily memorable. Okay, so for instance, Pirkei Avot I think it's much of chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot gives lists, right? There are 10 things, there are 5 things, there are 7. That helps with memory, right? Another rhetorical format in Pirkei Avot is what we might kind of call dichotomies. So, for instance, there's one that I'm thinking of, and you guys may know this one. I don't know the chapter and verse offhand, but we can find it for Karen to share. But it's a famous saying of Hillel. You know, you've heard of Hillel. So Hillel has a famous dichotomy, which is, if I am not for myself.
End of chapter 1.
Is chapter 1?
End of chapter 1.
End of chapter 1. Okay. So he says, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? That's kind of the dichotomy, right? It's like one thing and then the opposite. Okay. And that's a rhetorical formulation that, again, helps memorization or, easier. Okay. So that may be, I don't know who the audience would be, but certainly the community of rabbis themselves, in terms of learning the wisdom of the sages, you can remember stuff like that, right?
Thank you both very much for this.
Welcome. Other questions, text, what's in
I was
there?
just looking up if I have,
Oh, what do you
if we
see
have any
there?
questions. Nothing, no, just encouragement.
Oh, encouragement. Yeah. Come on, this is not a silent group. We know you got things percolating in there.
Here comes Steve.
Okay, Steve.
I'm curious to what you do about contradictions that exist in Pirkei Avot. Or perhaps maybe they're not contradictions. For example, one saying says, don't put any trust in the government, because that only looks out for themselves, or the ruling power, I should say. They only look out after their own welfare. But you have another saying that says, pray for the peace of the government, because without the government, people would eat each other alive.
Yeah.
Is that a contradiction?
Let's go. Okay, so that's good. Let's look at that one. That's a good place where we could say, we could study. Chapter 2, Karen, if you would go check out chapter 2, paragraph number 3. Let's see if that's it. Chapter 2, paragraph 3. Yeah. Okay. So this one, I think, is what Steve was referring to. Be careful in your dealings with the ruling authorities, for they do not befriend a person except for their own needs. They seem like friends when it is to their own interest, but they do not stand by a man in the hour of his distress. Okay, that's one I think you're thinking of. And then the other one was pray for the welfare of the government. Let's find where that one is. Is that nearby?
Yeah, it should be nearby.
Maybe is it the next one, or let's look at, let's see here.
Or it's chapter 3, perhaps.
Yeah, chapter 3, paragraph 2. See if we can scroll down to chapter 3, paragraph 2. Oh wait.
Yeah, there it is.
Pray, yeah, there it is. Rabbi Hanina, the vice high priest, said, pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear it inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive. Okay, these are great texts. Maybe we could sit and talk here a little bit about it. Okay, so on the one hand, the first one said, be wary of the government because they're kind of like, they're politicians, right? And they make friends when it suits them. They say what they need to say to butter you up so you vote for them, right? But they only have their own interests at heart. That's kind of the first one. And then the second one is pray for the welfare of the government. We need the government because if it weren't for them, everybody would kill each other. So let's talk about that. What are your thoughts on those two, maybe seemingly kind of contradictory ideas?
Well, it's kind of like government is a necessary evil. That government is absolutely essential, but it's not sufficient. In other words, you've got to have it, but you cannot simply take it wholesale without criticism.
Okay. All right, good. And why do you have to have it?
Oh, you have to have it because otherwise it does tend to lead to a war of all against all, that you don't have power located in a body that is going to be able to adjudicate it. It cannot stop an aggressor with adjudicated force.
Okay. So without government, there's no law. Right. Without government, there's no law to adjudicate disputes, to enforce certain behaviors that the community needs to exist. Did you find something in there?
There's a few points to say.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like we said, there's layers. So there's definitely something to talk about on a spiritual level as well, because you always appeal and at the core, there's actually something spiritual, which government generally, like we find in the Megillah, a lot of the sages say when we describe the government, we're actually describing God. When we describe King Ahasuerus, it's actually an allusion to God.
Huh.
So it's something, because God's name is actually not mentioned in the Megillah.
Yeah.
We don't find God's name in the Megillah. So there's definitely at its core, there's something very powerful about what's going on here in government, but there's a few aspects to think about here. There's a few things to really think about. Number one is you would look at it and the first statement doesn't say anything about the government specifically, but look at the words and you're looking at a word that says Berushits, the people who are in charge, the guys who are the government officials. And the other one is the general government. So you might want to make that distinction between saying you do need government, like, sorry, what was your name again? I forget again. Mike says is that you need a government, you do need a governing body, but maybe don't trust individuals, really. Because if you think about it, right, take a moment and think about someone who is willing to be a government official is probably not trustworthy, right? Why would he want that position, right? The people who we want to be in government positions don't want to do it, and the people we don't want are the only ones willing to do it. We found that in previous elections in the very recent future, or very recent past. So that does exist. So that might be one aspect of looking at it as well. And there's another interesting aspect of it, and this might not be something that we always appreciate, but what the Mishnah is discussing here is not a Jewish government. It's not government the way it's supposed to be according to Torah law, which is a religious monarchy, so to speak, right? It's supposed to be a king, a Jewish king who rules over the Jewish people in a kind way. And the descriptions that the Torah has and the Talmud has of the king are of a correct king, someone like King Saul before he turned a little bit off to the left, or King David or King Solomon. In other words, they were kings that were there for the right reasons. They weren't power hungry. You look right away at King Solomon's son, Rehoboam, I believe his name was, and he didn't listen to the advice of the elders, rather listened to the advice of the youngers, and he was led astray in that way. So we're talking about true kings, and here is not what we're discussing. We're discussing folks that were under Roman dictatorship. They were under those ministers, and they would do is, if you were familiar with the history, right, the Romans would put a Jewish man up as the governor or as the liaison of some sort, and often that person wasn't the best. They were tax collectors and they were doing things that were not necessarily in the best interest. So the idea of having, again, this idea is talking about a secular government, the government not run by the Jewish people in the way it's supposed to be run, rather a government that's not run correctly. So that's another thing to think about, I think. And then a third one is, if you really take a step back, and this might sound a little bit politically incorrect, is that what the Pirkei Avot is describing is libertarianism. That the job of the government is to protect people from one another and nothing else.
Yeah.
So again, that might be that idea. And again, let's remember that this is not halacha. We're not binding by law. This is the advice, and more than advice, this is the way to live life in the fullest way. So perhaps what the Pirkei Avot is telling us is that when you have a secular government, a government that is not yours, it's not a personalized government, it's not a government for the Jewish people, then maybe we should only want a libertarian type of government, because otherwise they're getting too involved. And then they're taking your money, or they're giving away your money, or they're not taking enough money, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So maybe just leave it libertarian, especially when you're dealing with a government that doesn't belong to you. It's not ours. It's not someone that they're not beholden to us. As a king would be, a Jewish king at the end of the day was beholden to the people. He was owned in a sense by the people, a proper Jewish king.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction between like government as an entity and the officials in government. And I guess like to me that, I mean, those two passages work together, you know, in the sense that government is necessary to a society. But the fact is that government is, by definition, it consists of people, and human beings are fallible, you know, and human beings are corruptible and whatnot. And that's the inherent kind of paradox of government, is we need it, but it is by definition inherently flawed, unless it's what Rabbi Eli is talking about, is kind of the messianic, you know, vision of government that's perfectly right and just. The question is, I mean, this is where I think in terms of intersection of, you know, kind of politics and religion, you know, I think that in my personal view, I think that there is a tendency, you know, in our society to kind of how do I want to put it? To kind of place kind of messianic hopes in politics of the present era. And that, in my view, is a mistake. Why? Because in the present era, which is not a messianic era, government is going to be conducted by flawed human beings. It will never be perfect. It will always be messed up. It will always let you down. And look, and I had a career in government, you know, in politics before becoming a rabbi, and like that's just the truth. It's never going to be, you know, government is never going to bring redemption. That has to happen through other means. That's my view. And so I think like I think Pirkei Avot is giving us a reality check. It's like, you got to have government in the era in which we live, the epoch of history in which we live. We have to have government to protect, you know, ourselves from each other and whatnot. But be wary of it. You know, don't go crazy in investing all your hopes in it. In fact, in the prophet Jeremiah says, do not place your faith in princes, right? Like earthly rulers are always going to let you down. They just will, because they're people just like us.
And actually, based on what Rabbi Stoller was saying, there's actually, I think it's in Jeremiah, where they put their trust in the Egyptian nation at the time to protect them from the Assyrians, I believe, that were going to attack. And God warns them, and then the Jewish people are punished for kind of hiring out a different government to protect them versus having trust in God. And as expected, the Egyptians just backed out and said, "Oh, we didn't mean it. We weren't. We never really meant it. We were never going to protect you." So that idea of putting trust in a government, that's again putting trust in a government, like Rabbi Stoller is saying, is completely off base. And I think that is, you're right, is what the thing is saying. And then it just brings up another thought I was thinking of, is that there's an adage, is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it could be that people get into government and they are in there for the right reasons. And I guess you could probably give more insight on that, because as you said, you had a career in government. And then as people are there for a little bit too long, then things start getting a little shaky when the power starts getting to your head.
Yeah.
I guess government's one of those things that nobody survives, which is actually one of the statements of the Pirkei Avot in chapter 1 or chapter 2, I'm sorry, is never trust yourself until the day you die.
Oh,
Rabbi Shmuel the Kohen Gadol says, I think it's in the beginning of chapter 2. Let me see. We can always pull it up on the screen so everybody can see it.
yeah. Never trust yourself.
Do not trust yourself until the day you die.
Use the web here to find
That's very good.
it. chapter 2, paragraph 4. Yeah. Karen's gonna get it there for us. Chapter 2, paragraph 4. There we go. This is what you're thinking of, Rabbi?
Yeah. Hill, I guess it was Hill who said it. Well, Tam ba'atzmach ad yom meisach. Do not trust in yourself until the day you die. Don't believe in other words, is that you're always fallible. You always have that evil inclination on that one side that you're always going to be battling. And that would be true of politicians as well, is that, you keep, you're in that world, and eventually it's going to affect you, I guess. I think that fits in here is that, you could have like we were saying, you could have a politician that maybe isn't there for the right reasons, but eventually he might get corrupted, probably will get corrupted.
Yeah,
I'm not promoting term limits, not saying anything like it. I'm just giving some thoughts.
Yeah.
I wish I'd had that line when I asked my students once, I said, how many think people in government are really corrupt? And they all raised their hand. I said, how many of you, if you were in government, would be corrupt? Nobody raised their hand. I said, we're pretty good people, aren't we?
Right.
We're just pretty extraordinary.
Well, right, that's right. And the system exerts its influence on you. Look at this one, by the way, since we have it pulled up. I think this is an example of kind of a rhetorical strategy of Pirkei Avot to help with, memorization or of learning the wisdom. Notice here, it's at least the kind of second half of it are sayings of Hillel's, a series of do not do this, do not do this, do not do this, right? So you could remember, Hillel had a kind of a string of things that I shouldn't do, right? So Hillel said, do not separate yourself from the community. Do not trust in yourself until the day of your death. Do not judge your fellow man until you have reached his place. Do not say something that cannot be understood, trusting that in the end it will be understood. And say not, when I shall have leisure, I shall study. Perhaps you will not have leisure. These are all great, awesome thoughts, and they stand independently of each other. What connects them, and the reason I think probably it's put together here in this paragraph, is because it's a string of do nots, and I can remember that Hillel told me a bunch of things that I'm not supposed to do, right? So I wonder if any of those in that list resonate with you guys. You want to pick up on one of his sayings and comment? Quiet group tonight. It is a quiet group tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
Do not separate yourself from the community is a very, very important concept upon which our Jewish community depends. Our Jewish community depends on people who will, it's a purely, the American Jewish community anyway, is a purely voluntary affair. Unless we have sufficient people willing to support that community, the community would not exist.
Nice, yeah. So, and do not separate yourself to the community is a call to every community member to think of themselves not only as individuals, but as part of a greater whole.
I mean, it's even more important in American Jewish community than it would have been if you had lived in which, let's say, there was a rabbinic authority that could fine you or otherwise punish you if you didn't behave and so forth and so on. But when you have a purely voluntary community, this concept becomes even more important, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Nice, thank you. Who else wants to say something? I don't know if are we going to have to start calling on people? Or
Yeah.
what do we
Well,
think?
just like hearing from you guys. You guys are very knowledgeable.
Well, so while Rabbi Eli, he's looking something up in his book, I wanted to say, I think my favorite one on there is the last one, say not when I shall have leisure, I shall study. Perhaps you will not have leisure. Okay, so I love that one because, well, I love to study and learn. And it's about making learning a priority in your life. And I think this is really important to me, like for rabbis and my own kind of pursuits, as a rabbi. I think that's super important because, and I want to say it, like take this opportunity to say to you as congregants why this is so important. Okay, I think in some cases, congregants might say like, you might be told, oh, the rabbi's spending time studying. You're like, that's nice, but the rabbi's got a lot of work to do. What's the rabbi sitting there reading books for? That's not work. That's not, that's leisure. Okay, but I would disagree with that. I think that studying is an essential part of our job. It's through studying that we're able to do our job. I study a lot. I'm working on a PhD. I love study. And I know that if I didn't study, I would have nothing to say. Like I'd show up here, I'd have nothing to talk about. I'd have nothing to say. Learning makes me a better rabbi. And I actually learned this lesson when I was, before I was a rabbi, when I was a press secretary for a US Senator. So I'll just tell you this story. So back then, in the early 2000s, I was press secretary, and in our press office, every day, a bunch of newspapers would be delivered to our office: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Chicago Tribune, the big papers, and they'd put them on the floor in our office, and I remember, I was like, well, I don't know about sitting there during work and like just kicking back and reading the paper. That feels like kind of like I'm slacking off, So and then my chief of staff came in at one time and he's like, why aren't you reading the papers? And I was like, well, I have work I need to do. And he said, reading the papers is part of your job. You need to spend time during the day reading the papers. And so I took that as permission, like, okay, I'll sit there and read the papers. And then of course, he was right. I needed to read all those papers because that's what enabled me to be a good press secretary. Studying enables me to be a good rabbi. And then I would go the one further and say that studying Judaism enables you to be good Jews. You can't be Jewish if you don't learn, if you don't know what you're supposed to do. So all of you guys are committed to study. You're here, but don't say that's extracurricular. It's just something that I'll do like if I have time. Make it a priority in your life.
I just want to add on to what Rabbi Stoller is saying here because it's actually what Shammai says in chapter 1. That was one of the things I prepared.
Oh, nice.
Chapter 1, Mishnah 15. So if we go back there, and it really goes into depth here about
which paragraph again?
15.
In chapter 1,
Chapter 1, yeah. Oh, you got to go all the way back. It's towards
Here we are.
yeah. So Shammai says, make your Torah permanent, make your Torah study permanent. And what he's referencing here, if you really think about it, he's going back to earlier in chapter 1. We said that the world stands. I think it's in verse 3 or paragraph 3. It says the world stands on 3 things: Torah, service, and kindness, and acts of kindness. And he says that the Torah has to be the core of it. The Torah study has to be the permanent, the core of it. And then he continues, Emor ma'at v'aseh harbe, that you don't even have to study in halachic terms. Emor would be describing that concept of studying in order to speak, in order to give halachic ruling. It says you don't have to speak. You don't have to study in that kind of format where it's applicable necessarily. Study the Torah in a more generalized form, just studying the Torah. And it's a very important lesson, is because, again, making you a better Jew, that's one aspect of it. But the other part of it is that Torah is divine. It's divine intellect, it's divine knowledge. And when you study it, you're really creating a relationship with God. And that's something really powerful, that there's no really other way to do it. You can have a relationship with God by doing mitzvot. That's one aspect of it. But having an intellectual relationship with God is only through studying Torah. And again, not necessarily only studying Torah that's pertinent to mitzvah obligations. And it's important to remember that this comes from Shammai, because if you're focusing, Shammai is the counterpoint of Hillel. And in 95% of disputes between Shammai and Hillel and the Talmud, Shammai loses. So there is a discussion in halachic authorities. If I am studying Shammai's opinion in the Torah, am I studying Torah? Because we don't follow his opinion. And the answer is yes. Yes. And the Talmud says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These are both words of God, of a living God. The words of Shammai, even though they're not pertinent to halacha today, they're not pertinent to how we should live our lives, is studying Torah. And that's very, very important. As Rabbi Stoller was saying, is that it makes you a better Jew. It really gives you a relationship with God. It opens your mind, and it allows you to ask us questions. It makes us also better rabbis, because then we have to stay on our toes, and we have to study a little bit more too.
Yeah, and to that point about studying as an avenue for relationship with God, and study as not only an intellectual activity, but a spiritual one. I think the point that Rabbi Eli is making is really important. I want to highlight the idea that we don't only study text for practical application. That is certainly one element of study and one reason to study. And I think in our culture in which we live, I think we tend to think of learning, studying for that reason. You should learn so that you know stuff that you can use, right? But actually, and that is a part of Judaism, to be sure. But actually, there's a scholar of rabbinic literature named Christine Hayes, and she wrote a great book in which she explores this, and she kind of demonstrates through an analysis of Talmudic literature that she makes this argument that for the sages, the purest and highest form of study was to study a material that has no practical application. That's the highest level of study, because it's strictly learning for the sake of learning for developing your mind, developing a relationship with God, a connection. You're not learning for utilitarian purposes. I'm doing this to take out and go do something with it. I'm just engaged with God and with other people.
Isn't that also, though, isn't it true that there may not be an immediate practical application, but there may be later.
True.
And I remember there's this great story about one of the main mathematicians in Britain in the 1930s who loved studying math only because it had no practical application. That part of math. Turned out he was one of the key code breakers of the German.
Wow. Okay. So you never know what's going to have practical application in your life later. So I think like what I learned from what Rabbi Eli is saying based on the teaching of Shammai is that making learning a part of your life, just because learning in and of itself is the value and is valuable, is a way to be. That's midat hasidut. That's a great way of living.
Just for fun, let me throw out another one that's connected, though. There's a saying that all study of the Torah and no work can lead to sin. So how do they justify studying the Torah, all day long?
There is no justification, to be honest. I mean, to say there's no justification, I think would be wrong, but you find that throughout Pirkei Avot is the idea of what we call, you said work, but the term that it's used is derech eretz, the way of the world. In other words, there's a primary importance to providing for yourself and for your family. And the idea of, and you'll find that a lot, if you look through actually a lot of the names that you have in the Talmud, a lot of them have names that have at the end of it a description of what their job was. There was Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. He was a shoesmith. He was one rabbi who was known he was a tanner, which was one of the dirtiest and smelliest jobs back in the day, and that's what he did for a living. Again, so much, and it's actually mentioned here in Pirkei Avot, is that it's better to work in a tannery, I think, than to take money from charity, to take money from as charity. So that idea, being someone who collects alms, is really not recommended here in the Talmud. The idea of studying, and therefore, and actually it says the Ishtamish B'Saga Chalaf. That's mentioned in chapter 1. I don't remember which one it is, but you can probably go a little bit up. or maybe a little down, right here.
Well, I just wondered in face of this,
I still go down one, go a little further down, right here. Shmaya Avtalion. Shmaya and Avtalion said received the Torah tradition from the ones before. They used to say love work and hate acting the superior. Do not attempt to draw so, but again, hate love work. I'm sorry, love work. It's always important to do work. And then if you go down a little further, there's going to be the shtamish, someone who uses the crown here. The last here. Huaya Omer. You're good there. A little lower. Sorry, I'm directing. Let's see the last line. One who makes unworthy use of the crown, Torah study of learning, shall pass away. In other words, if you use the Torah for your own benefit, death sentence.
Yeah.
So that's the idea of using the Torah and kind of, right? And that always asks the question, how could there be rabbis that are getting paid to study Torah?
Yeah, right.
I'm not going to answer that question right now.
Right. And then I think Steve is thinking about, okay, Karen, would you mind going to chapter 3, paragraph 17? This is another one of these dichotomies or the paradoxes in Pirkei Avot. Let's see, chapter 3, number 17. Yeah, okay. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, where there is no Torah, there is no right conduct. Where there is no right conduct, there is no Torah. That's what Rabbi Eli was referring to, the Torah and derech eretz.
Yes.
Okay, then there's also where there is no wisdom, there is no fear of God. Where there's no fear of God, there is no wisdom. Where there is no understanding, there is no knowledge. Where there is no knowledge, there is no understanding. Where there is no bread, this is the one I wanted to get to. Where there is no bread, there is no Torah. Where there is no Torah, there is no bread. This in Hebrew, im ein kemach ein Torah, im ein Torah ein kemach. And that passage is the one that kind of highlights this idea that you have to study Torah and you have to work. The one is dependent upon the other. Right, and it's mutual. And let's unpack that for a second. If there's no where there's no bread, there's no Torah. Bread being like substance, like money, work. You got if you're not earning money, there's no Torah, and if you're not studying Torah, there's no earning money. That's a paradox. Or it's a dichotomy. So let's unpack that. What does that mean? Why is it so that without the one, there's not the other?
I mean, they're calling for whole personhood, to participate in the world as it is and to make the world as it is better through studying God's wisdom.
Nice. Thank you. Other thoughts?
I'll add on to Mike, because that's definitely the mission of humanity, is to really perfect the world, take the world and make it into a better place. And that could be done through Torah. Torah actually, something interesting to think about. The word Torah, what does it mean? What does the word Torah mean? It stems from the word hora'ah, which means a lesson. The Torah is a lesson book. It's a guidebook telling us how to live our lives. And the way to make the world the best place it can be is by studying and practicing the Torah. And that's exactly what you're saying, is that you have to study, right? Imagine trying to put together an IKEA piece of furniture without the instruction manual. You'll end up with a different piece of furniture, or maybe not. So that's the idea. You want to really create the perfect world, but that can only be done with the blueprints of the world, which is the Torah, the guidebook, the instruction manual. And that's that, right? So you can't just live like, oh, I know what to do. I'll right. There is a certain aspect that the Talmud describes that if not for the Torah, there were certain aspects of life that we would have understood from the animals, right? The idea of cleanliness from a cat, for example, right? A cat always digs in his litter and certain things, right? There's monogamy in certain animals we'd have learned from that. But certain elements of the godliness of Torah, of the moral, like you said, the morals can't be studied from a book. They have to be transmitted. that has to come from the Torah. That really has to come from the tradition and yeah, you do need both. And that's definitely, to answer Steve's question, the answer is no, you can't just study, you can't be a hermit. That existed actually, the Hasidic movement, one of the things that they fought against versus what was going on before, there were a lot of hermits. People sat in little rooms, they got a little piece of bread, and that's all they did was study Torah. And the Hasidic movement was no, it's you work the land, and you're into the Baal Shem Tov traveled through Eastern Europe, bringing joy to the laborers that didn't have the great minds to study Torah in depth. Rather, they were reading the book of Psalms, they were praying, they were very involved in their service, and they studied whatever Torah they could, and that's very important. Combining my actions, my day-to-day purpose, and affecting the world, right? God created the world that we should have an effect on it. If you're not doing anything to affect the world, then you're not really doing anything. That lesson actually comes in with the Torah portions that we're going to read right after Pesach, the portion of Acharei. After the death of Aaron's two sons, what Aaron's sons did that was wrong was that they tried to live above the world, to live a supernatural life, to live without affecting the world. They didn't get married. They were trying to bring incense at the time that wasn't supposed to, because they wanted their souls to be elevated to on high, which is not the way things should be. You're supposed to live in this world in a physical body and do physical actions that affect the world in a positive way. And that's, again, the lesson here of Pirkei Avot throughout, and then again, the lesson from Aaron's sons. So everything is really connected.
Absolutely. Karen, would you mind taking us to chapter 3, section 8? So to follow on what Rabbi Eli is saying, I think this might be, I want to show the concept of Bitul Torah. Let's have that. Where do we get where do we find this 3:8? No, that's not it. Rabbi, do you know where we get Bitul Torah from? Let's see.
Well, the verse is quoted from the words, Dvar Hashem Bazal, the word of Hashem, he is embarrassed or desecrated. I don't know if it mentions it here in the Pirkei Avot.
Okay, wasting. All right, so I don't know where this text is or if it's in Pirkei Avot, but so to go in conjunction with what we were just talking about, there is a concept in halakha, which is called Bitul Torah, which means like kind of the negation of Torah. And the idea is that if you're not studying Torah, you're wasting time. So you have to reconcile that with the teachings here about it. If there's no bread, there's no Torah, and so forth. Because the sages felt like that if you're out doing what they call frivolous stuff, and I guess we have to, I don't know how to define frivolous things, but it's like if you're out doing stuff, then what you're doing is you're detracting from Torah. So I think people who, and I know Steve, like your question is kind of coming from a place of, we know that there are people out there in the yeshivas and so forth, and they don't work, they just study, right? And then they take welfare from the state or whatever. And their justification is the principle of Bitul Torah. It's like, if I'm not in the study hall studying Torah, I'm wasting God's time and I'm negating the Torah. Is there?
I guess that's where it comes from. Again, the idea, like, I hate to say it, like, people like to, like, on the religious community or the Jewish community in general, people like to focus in on the people that are not doing the right thing, where you have that same concept all around the world. You have slackers who are living off welfare in all parts of society. And true, I guess we're looked at and we're supposed to be better than that. That's right. That's the Jewish people. We're a light unto the nations. And I guess that's why they pick on those things. But yeah, that is something. And actually, you can scroll a little bit back to what Rabbi Stoller was saying is in chapter 3, in number 2, I think it is, paragraph 2, towards the end of it. So it describes sitting down for a meal. Towards the middle. What do we got here? Here, yeah. If two sit right at the end of Psalms 1:1, or even before that. But if two sit together, let's go a little bit above that, yeah. If two sit together, yeah, right there. If two sit together and there are no words of Torah spoken between them, then this is a session of scorners. And then it continues, but if two sit together and do study Torah, how great it is, and it continues on to different value, different amounts of people that might be sitting together, and it describes if three people are sitting together at one table and eating, and they don't discuss Torah thoughts, it's as if they are eating of idolatrous food, or of how does he translate it here?
Let me ask this.
Offer to the dead.
Tables are full of filthy vomit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could we say the rabbis that we're discussing here were not immune from hyperbole?
I think that is true. But I guess the point is, like, if to midat chasidut, to live by, kind of beyond what's just basically required and live in a pious life, is that the words of Torah should always be on your lips. You should always be talking about things that matter. If you sit down and you're talking about American Idol and, popcorn or whatever, that's just frivolity and waste is what the sages are saying. So like, you should always make a measure of like to, spend your time in a good way. I guess like it is hyperbolic, but it's also a kind of an important lesson that like, time is a gift, time is valuable, and we shouldn't fritter it away on stupid stuff.
And there's definitely that spiritual aspect of it.
Yeah.
You're saying frivolity is the essence of what we call something that's dead, that's described in the scriptures, is something that has no life force to it, has no energy to it. And when you're discussing, like you said, whatever the popular culture is, or whatever the American Idol, whatever, I don't think it still exists.
Yeah.
So then you really are eating a sacrifice of food to the dead, to what has no life. True life is something that has vitality, something that has meaning, etc. I mean, and this is not necessarily true, but I would say even like discussing politics and describing how America should handle the war in Ukraine, we're really having no effect on it, right? We all know that just because we're speaking about it doesn't mean that it's going to have an effect. Not saying that we shouldn't have our minds on the people in Ukraine, but how the politicians should do their job. I'm wondering if that's even
Like armchair quarterback.
armchair presidenting or whatever it is. I wonder if that also includes, people get very, very, involved in their politics, and you have to, there's a measure of politics that's necessary, but there's a lot of politics that we talk about that we really have no practical.
No, but there are other things. There's a saying here, and Pirkei Avot to say, if you stop and say, "What a beautiful tree," that you
A
just
lot of layers, Steve. There's a lot of layers to that one. We'll have to leave it to the greatest hits. It's a great one, though.
One thing I'd like to do as we wrap up, just ask for each of you to respond to, if you were to tell the people, why is it important for them to pay any attention at all to Pirkei Avot? In a very short summary, why that at all?
I'll give a quick answer is, and this is described in different places, that similar concept is, imagine the Torah was a steak, and the Pirkei Avot are your salt and pepper. So the rest of the Torah is it's dry, and this gives you a little spice, a little extra flavor to it that allows you to live it with a little bit more joy and a little more perspective. So imagine a piece of steak that's unseasoned, and then Pirkei Avot is kind of your salt and pepper.
I like that. Yeah, I would say, I like that. I'd say, I think it's got great wisdom for life.
All right. I want to wish everybody a happy Pesach. Hope everybody has their seders all scheduled and all taken care of. I would offer, if anybody needs handmade shmura matzah, give us a ring.
Got some right here from Rabbi Eli.
Got some from Ukraine and from Israel. We like to make sure everybody has some handmade round shmura matzah for their seder. So you know where to find us. We're at Chabad.